Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 15th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then asking our colleagues to comment on it. At the end, we'll have time for Coburn's Corner, where we'll nominate cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. So we're cablecasting from Neptune on the 12th of April, 2013, an anniversary about war-making by criminal presidents. On this day in 1861, the American Civil War began when Confederate forces fired on the resupply of Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Contrary to U.S. mythology, the war was chosen by the U.S. president, who had other options, and was not necessary to end slavery, which, in fact, it largely failed to do. It transferred chattel slavery into a particularly vicious form of wage slavery for generations of African Americans in the South. The history has recently been examined in a couple of studies, and the outbreak of the war, which figures so heavily in American mythology, has been the subject of a quite brilliant book by a Civil War historian whose the thesis of the book is announced in its title, William Marvel's Mr. Lincoln Goes to War. On this day in 1919, Eugene V. Debs entered prison for opposing U.S. entry into World War I, for violating the Espionage Act, Woodrow Wilson's law, which had nothing to do with espionage and spying, and a great deal to do with criticizing government policy. It criminalized it, and we remember that the famous declaration about free speech from the American courts, that free speech doesn't include falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, actually referred to those people who criticized Woodrow Wilson's rush into the First World War. Criticizing the war, encouraging opposition to the draft was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater and was illegal. Eugene Debs went to prison for it, and Wilson's hatred of Debs was so great that at the end of the war, when other resistors were pardoned, Wilson specifically refused to pardon Wilson, and it was Wilson explicitly refused to pardon Debs, and it was his successor who finally did. On this day in 1935, 150,000 college students across the country staged the first nationwide student strike against war. The protest was against participation in any war. This is 1935, in the 30s. During its peak years, from spring of 36 to spring of 39, the anti-war movement, the student anti-war movement in America, mobilized at least 500,000 collegians, and given the size of the population in American colleges right now, that was in fact about half of the American student body. It mobilized students into one-hour strikes against the war on a regular basis. It was this movement and the anti-war sentiment that it represented that had to be overcome by the Roosevelt administration in order to manipulate the U.S. into the Second World War. I considered that a very serious problem, and the solution was based on the Sumter model, the engineering of an attack by the Japanese Navy on Pearl Harbor was the policy of the Roosevelt administration to arrange for the Japanese to strike the first blow to overcome the deep anti-war sentiment in the U.S. And perhaps fittingly, on this day in 1945, President Roosevelt died. The historical echoes are perhaps important. His vice president, Harry Truman, was sworn in, and we've recently heard from Oliver Stone an account of the circumstances that produced the removal of Henry Wallace as Roosevelt's vice president, with the suggestion that Wallace becoming president in 1945 would have followed quite a different course. I'm not sure whether that's true. Counterfactuals in history are always difficult, but it does point out what actually did happen, the belligerent policy of American presidents for more than a century, and the fact that you're listening to News from Neptune, a criminal war leaders edition. We'll start with Ron Szoke, who will tell us about springtime for Obama and America.
Right. Springtime for higher education is where I'll start.
Okay.
But then I'll go on to a second point, which will be a rather big one. We can't deal adequately with it today, but we may return to it in the future. First point, the economics of higher education in this country. Interesting article in the USA Today recently. The governor of Texas, in view of mounting college costs and the difficulty of financing higher education by the state, ordered the college people in Texas to come up with a $10,000 degree. The average amount being spent on a college education, four-year degree today, is about $90,000. More and more students have student loan indebtedness approaching that, or in some cases exceeding it, if they go to a professional school, medicine or law or whatever. And these are claimed to be crises in higher education. So this person says that college is many things, but cheap is not one of them. 2/3 of students finish college with some amount of debt. The average amount tops $26,000. So one intriguing idea comes from Rick Perry and Rick Scott, the Republican governors of Texas and Florida, respectively. Last year, Perry asked public universities in the state to submit plans for a degree that would cost no more than $10,000 in tuition for all 4 years. And I would say good luck with that. But anyway, why do we have this problem? In part because it's a matter of trying to operate universities and lower education as well as businesses to try to turn them into profit-making organizations. And that has never worked. Again and again, we hear from would-be educational reformers that we need to operate the schools and indeed the universities as a business. That has never worked. It's so contrary to the aims and functions of education at any level that we don't see that it's failed again and again. And but people still keep urging it because of the prominence, the status of business thought and values in our culture. And if there's something that people want or need, something as education, then someone else should be able to make a profit out of it. And that has gone on again and again. It's become notorious in some quarters, in the case, for example, of corrections, imprisonment, and so on, profit-making prisons being operated now, and more and more reliance on mercenary soldiers, the military, and so on, contractors for the Pentagon, and so on. So it's the perennial right-wing approach that anything can be done only if someone else can make a profit out of doing it. And so if people are starving, they're sick, they lack education and so on, well, there must be some way for someone to make a profit out of that. Privatization, for example, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were a whole class of people who got in early there, bought up the resources of the Soviet Union, became multi-billionaires as a result, stashed a lot of their money in Cyprus, including other tax havens, and we've seen what that has led to. Now there are new articles coming out about the competition among potential tax havens, about not only Russian money, but many other extremely wealthy people around the world. So Cyprus has retreated into the background, and now they're feeling more and more heat from the Caymans, Bermuda, wherever else other people think they can find a tax haven. Meanwhile, has this reformed the operations of American capitalism? Apparently not. The New York Times in the deal book tells us about at banks, the board pay soars among cutbacks. So there have been some relatively minor decreases in the perks, the options, and so on that are offered to top management. But the corresponding pay for board members and the salaries of the executives have gone up. The economic differentiation continues, and there are more and more extremely wealthy people who are looking for places to put their money where it won't be taxed. They can avoid the IRS in that way. So what can be done about higher education? The usual prescription is online courses, partnerships, and so on. And I've talked about a bit about this before. Degrees offered for online courses will not meet the functions of higher education. A hidden or latent function of much higher education is as a mating ground, arena for the elite, the upper middle class and upper class in this country. Something that the conservative columnist in the New York Times, Russ Douthat, talked about recently. That's where young people of the suitable social class get together and choose their mates. And it's interesting, that's where I found my wife, for example, and I'll ask these other two gentlemen, did you meet your spouse in an academic context and allow the university to carry out its hidden function there?
Well, of course, our mentor, Noam Chomsky, met his spouse in preschool.
Exactly, right. Exactly, right. Yeah, if you wait until college, you've obviously waited too long.
Yeah.
Well, I was fascinated by the fact that Rouse Douthat, the conservative columnist of the New York Times, was willing to spill the beans about why what kids are doing at Princeton these days and all the other Ivy League schools in a somewhat different way than they were doing it 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah. Now it's a matter of potential high earners mating with potential high earners rather than women, as it used to be said in the 50s, going to college to get their MRS degrees. So things have changed, but I think when I read that quote by Douthat on the Angry Arabs blog without knowing who it was, and so I clicked to see who it was, and I think it's telling that a conservative is willing to say that in ways that perhaps some liberals wouldn't be.
Yeah. His article starts with Susan Patton, a Princeton alumna who became famous for her letter urging Ivy League women to use their college years to find a mate, has been denounced as a traitor to feminism, to coeducation, to the university ideal, but really she's something much more interesting, a traitor to her class. Her betrayal consists in being gauche enough to acknowledge publicly a truth that everyone who's come up through the Ivy League culture knows intuitively, that elite universities are about connecting more than learning, that the social world matters far more than the classroom to undergraduates, and that rather than an escalator elevating the best and the brightest from every walk of life, the meritocracy as we know it mostly works to perpetuate the existing upper class. So yeah, he has interesting insights from time to time, pointing out that every elite seeks its own perpetuation, of course, but that project is uniquely difficult in a society that's formally democratic and egalitarian and colorblind. Yeah, that's the social function of higher education, which apparently will not be met if courses and degrees are offered online. Although there may be someone who will figure out a way around that too. Who knows?
Well, I must say that the change in elite universities over the last 50 years is not perhaps in the direction that we think it is, and is much more captured by Walter Ben Michael's important book, How We Learn to What?
The trouble with diversity.
Trouble with diversity. How we learn to love the counterpoints diversity and equality. Yeah. We substituted the press for diversity for the press for equality. And my point is that I can testify from my own multi-decade experience, or my family's multi-decade experience, in the remarkable change of at least one elite university from an egalitarian spirit 50 years ago to a remarkable corruption of money in later years. Now, you may say that's terribly impressionistic, but the numbers the numbers bear it out. The actual statistics about equality in America, measured by things like the Gini Index and wealth, shows that equality in America peaked, as it were, in the 1960s and has been declining at an accelerating rate ever since then. That is, America has become increasingly less equal. Ron's made this point frequently in our discussions here. America has become increasingly less equal, and it's done so faster and faster over those 50 years. Well, it certainly has shown up in the elite universities. And those of us who've had the good fortune, if that's quite what it is, to kick around universities for many years, can see it. I can see it, as I say, in my own family's association with this institution. We have this sort of complacent notion that movements towards inclusiveness and so forth are generally successful. But that's not true on a class basis. It's not true in regard to equality. And one of the places it shows up most strikingly, I think, is in the elite universities.
Yeah, that interesting sage, Frank Zappa, once said that if you want to get laid, go to college. If you want an education, go to the library.
One wonders whether the wish was father for the thought for Frank, but still.
Still, I feel that it's overrated to a certain extent, the idea that the mass commodification of schooling is really going to make any difference in the class structure. I mean, the availability of online courses, what are called MOOCs, these massive open online courses. The function, obviously, the higher education serves a class function, and to do so, it has to differentiate between what it means to get to go to the University of Phoenix and to go to Harvard. And there isn't any less effort being put in, and in fact, much more effort, of course, in this era, to prepare students, to prepare an elite of students, that's 5 or 10 or 15 or at most 20% of students, to go to the Ivy League schools, the University of Chicago, Stanford, and the better public colleges like this one, to gain an advantage, to have a credential that says something different to graduate schools, to law schools, medical schools. And the system really hasn't, in that aspect, the system hasn't changed at all, as much as we've sort of have come to sort of fetishize the idea that everybody should go to college and that it would mean something if everyone did. On one level, because so many more people go to college, it doesn't mean a lot more for many people than what it meant to graduate from high school 50 or 60 years ago. But it still means an awful lot to those who go to the better colleges. And the better classes are not going to let that change.
I came across a line of John Dewey's this last week when he points out, and I'm quoting, "Education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself." Yes. And if we were really to take that seriously, and I don't think we do when we talk about college education these days, because mainly we do take even college education even for the privileged people who attend elite colleges, it's thought of, spoken of, as some sort of vocational training. You go to a good college to learn to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a banker. And the notion that education is an investment which pays off in lifetime salary certainly is foreign to what John Dewey was saying. And if we were to think about it in his terms, then we might begin to understand why it is important that, as the economist Doug Henwood points out, there is no structural reason that higher education couldn't be free in this country. The actual costs are very small to do that. There are demonstrations in Chile right now, student demonstrations in Chile, much like the student demonstrations in Quebec last year, that are not being much reported in this country. At least I haven't seen much about them. And one of the demands of the Chilean students is the continuation of free higher education and the expansion of free higher education. The higher education was free in Britain until the right-wing Labour government came in 1997. It wasn't Mrs. Thatcher's government that did it. It was Tony Blair's government that did it. And as Noam Chomsky has pointed out recently, the explosion of student debt in this country, occasioned, of course, by the rapid rise in tuitions, far faster than inflation and so forth. The explosion of student debt is not only a boon for bankers, it's funny, the American government seems to want to do nice things for bankers, but it also is a method of social control.
Yes.
Those of us old enough to remember, are sometimes surprised that the Bush-Obama wars in Southwest Asia haven't produced a criticism from campuses that came of the Southeast Asian wars a generation or so ago. One of the reasons it hasn't is that you have a much more docile student body and, I must say, a much more docile faculty who were recently part of that student body in American universities. They're all very quiet. They owe a lot of money. They need the jobs. They need the education in the sense of vocational preparation so they can pay off their loans. The social control of the modern education system is not an accident. It's a conscious policy, a policy that is based on determining that what happened in, quote, the 60s, close quote, doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I believe there's a classic paper talking about the sorting and selecting function of education. So we find supposedly capable young people, and we select them out by academic processing. And at the same time, we cool out, as it said, the aspirations of the other people who don't do well in school. And it's essential that they acquire the conviction that they don't really deserve to be wealthy or to succeed, and so on. And one of the problems with dealing with ordinary types of liberals is that they want to keep bringing forth the idea that we need education in order to reform society. And education, as we know it, that is years spent in school and college and so on, will do nothing in itself to reform the system. It just perpetuates it. People are selected and sorted primarily on the basis not of ability but of acquiescence in the demands of the system. That's what a degree ordinarily represents, as much as any intellectual achievement.
One of John Dewey's colleagues was Randolph Bourne, or one of his sort of co-conspirators of that era. Of course, Randolph Bourne, the difference being that Randolph Bourne was opposed to our entrance into World War I, whereas John Dewey was brought around in favor of it. And Randolph Bourne was also someone who was an educational critic of that era. And in one of his educational writings, he reflected, I think, what John Dewey said in that he said, now we have an institution, but what we need is a life in terms of how our schools work. And he did a lot of writing about that.
Yeah, I believe Dewey regretted his initial support.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And he came around to writing another article,
Yes.
saying an explanation of our lapse.
Yes. Yeah. Well, history's complicated.
Yeah, but it was notorious that 100 of the top scholars in Germany, for example, who you would expect better things of, supported the war enthusiastically. It was really disillusioning.
You're watching news from Neptune. Carl Estabrook, Ron Szoke, David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. We'll go to David Green. What's top of your list this week, David?
Well, it's baseball season, and Casey Stengel famously, when one of his poor hitters on the New York Mets, the sort of sad New York Mets team of the early 60s, went up with the bases loaded and asked what his strategy should be, Casey Stengel famously said, "Take one for the team." and on behalf of the News from Neptune team, I've taken a couple the last couple weeks. One is I attended a talk by one Norman Augustine, formerly CEO of Lockheed Martin, who was brought to our campus by Phyllis Wise to speak to us about envisioning the future of the research university. This provoked a small protest out in front of to the entrance, the east entrance of Beckman, which, from what I understand from one of our colleagues, was suppressed or at least intimidated by the university cops. Certainly, it was a full house, a relatively full house in the Beckman Auditorium, to hear a rather sort of boilerplate neoliberal analysis of the fact that the world has brought us technological innovation and globalization. That has brought us economic inequality and a certain amount of desperation, and therefore we need better technological innovation and better education to spur that technological innovation. And the future of our university should, of course, be based around recruiting those students. Our entire educational system, in fact, from top to bottom, should be geared towards recruiting those students who are going to develop the better mousetraps to make us a more competitive economy, and all of the neoliberal boilerplate that goes along with this sort of mentality. The audience, of whom I recognized a few people. First of all, let me say that upon sitting down, I didn't participate in this protest. I went inside, and upon sitting down, I heard a couple of faculty members, one of whom is known to me, bemused at the prospect of demonstrators in front of this, in conjunction to
System works.
to this event. And I think if I overheard correctly, one of the other faculty members, an older gentleman, saying to the effect of, "I haven't seen this sort of thing in 40 years." They weren't exactly making a ruckus out there. It certainly wasn't anything that was. It certainly wasn't anything that any red-blooded activist from the 1960s would want to compare their more assertive efforts to. It wasn't exactly the Berkeley free speech movement, but still, there is an out-of-touch quality. I mean, given the level of scientific learning and technological learning that goes on in this campus, there's a real, I sense there's something really out of touch with the idea of what the root of our economic problems really are. There is much to be said about that, of course, as we often do on this program. It's a complicated issue, but just to reiterate that it can't possibly have anything to do with better test scores and better, what they call STEM, scientific technology, math education. It can't possibly be fundamentally related to the quality of that. We have the best researchers in the world. We have the best computer technological research and in innovation going on. The question is, why doesn't the prosperity, why doesn't the value added from this work and from this development trickle down to the mass of population? The other thing I took for the team, the other hardball, that was more of going to the Augustine lecture was sort of taking a hardball for the team. Last night was sort of taking a softball for the team, and that was to attend an event at the Champaign Public Library, which explored the problem of the so-called problem of civility in political and public life. It was a rather desultory event, which was a panel of 6 people, including a couple of News Gazette editors. One of them actually moderated, John Foreman, as well as a faculty member from the journalism school, and someone from the League of Women Voters, and a couple of local politicians or former politicians, Tim Johnson and Rick Winkle, the latter of which is kind of a distant colleague of mine. But in any event, it was a poorly attended event, even though there was a color advertisement for it in the newspaper yesterday. It was certainly well known that there was an event that people could attend to discuss these apparently extremely important issues. But there was really only about 30 people who turned out, about 20 people who were there, and 25 people who were there, and then 10 high school students who came in probably at the behest of their civics teacher, unfortunately. But in any event, there was little to be learned at this event except that civility, to me, civility is not a problem. If it really was a real problem, I assume it would have attracted more people on both sides, both of the people who are pro-civility and anti-civility. I'm sure that I was the only person there who was essentially anti-civility, although I didn't express that. It kind of felt like being at it sort of felt like being at a conference about apathy and not caring about challenging the notion of whether or what we were doing in a conference.
Nobody shows up for the
but so in any event, it just the level of public political discourse that we're exposed to. I mean, aside from the events that I've talked about on previous shows, when David Harvey and Rashid Khalidi and people like that have come to our campus, and other people, I'm sure, the sort of those events that advertise them as sort of appealing to a sort of a public intellectual quality leave a lot to be desired in terms of the level of discourse and their willingness to tackle difficult issues. Of course, the whole, I could go on and on about the whole civility issue and where it's coming from. It's really all about, I think both of these events to a certain extent are about the manufacture of consent, broadly speaking, and the idea
Limits
that
of allowable
we,
debate.
Pardon?
I said yes, benefit and limits of allowable debate.
Limits of
actually,
allowable
right,
debate,
right.
and the idea that people who are well known and successful in our system, in what Noam Chomsky calls capitalism as we know it, or
Yes.
really existing capitalism, have to sort of feel that they're contributing to an enlightened discussion, and that they're engaged in all this kind of stuff, and it's really pretty much of a sad commentary that there really isn't as one of the commentators said last night. He invoked the expression about the incivility in so much discourse of being a lot of heat but not much light, and last night there was neither heat nor light.
I can only stand astonished and amazed at your willingness to suffer for the common good.
Well,
here,
I only
David.
stayed for the first 45 minutes.
That's enough suffering, I think, under the
Yeah.
circumstances. I will say that Jim Dye, who was on the panel, I gather, I was not at this. I don't have David's staying power or good devotion at all. But Dye tells me that he was to appear for the anti-side on civility. But I don't know if that was borne out in fact. But when I said something to him about before the panel about what he was doing there, he said he was appearing on the anti
Yeah.
side.
He was
Perhaps he was joshing me.
Yeah, he was perhaps lacking in some of the piety that the other. But I mean, if there was a substantive issue raised, at least, was whether is this incivility issue, is it sort of a bottom-up problem, or is it a top-down problem? Is it because the people are watching too much wrestling and too much cable television?
Oh, dear.
Or is it because the Bill O'Reillys and Sean Hannitys, or the MSN, I mean this sort of litany of the MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, are they creating this environment in which it is so difficult to have civil discourse? But what would that civil discourse be? I mean, we're not asking the right question. I mean, obviously.
I think you had it. Yeah.
They're not asking the right questions here. And that leads to, obviously, not the right answers.
I think you had the point right early on. What this really means, what this really is about, is the fear that the discussion will get out of control, that things will be said and asked that shouldn't be, that the sorts of control that exists, the limits of allowable debate, are being threatened by people who say this president who got a Peace Prize kills children. And this is incivil talk that must be put down. I think that the task, I hope the task is beyond them. That what we will get is a good deal more incivility, real political questions about why Obama is lying about Social Security, why the child killing continues.
But Carl, I don't even think the left, as it's hopefully represented on this program, is just barely on the radar of this whole civility issue. I mean, what they're talking about is the incivility of those from the right who criticize Obama, and then perhaps the incivility of those on the allowable left, or the sort of liberal left. And then these leftists are seen as they're so far out in the fact that they're criticizing Obama that it doesn't even make it into the whole scheme of things.
No, they're also concerned about the sort of Tea Party talk that we've been getting for a while now. You know, these Tea Party people are actually dangerous from the point of view of establishment politics because they're stepping outside the lines. Now, in fact, what's happened is that they've pretty well been brought back in, and that they now represent simply, a fringe within the American political establishment. But it represented real distress when it first appeared. It was a very strange phenomenon. It was an astroturf movement, that is a fake grassroots movement, that developed a real grassroots following there for a while and scared people for that reason. You had to put the genie back in the bottle. And for the most part, they've managed to do it. The Tea Party is now just a comfortable aspect of Republican Party politics. But that's what was meant by incivility. There are various examples of that. Chomsky has a point about saying the easiest way to control a debate is to have two opposed positions that are both comfortably within the consensus that the ruling class wants to control, and then let them go at it. Let them have a wild time, Republicans, Democrats. We saw that in the last presidential election, where two candidates with essentially the same positions on crucial issues mobilized defenders by saying, it'll be so terrible if the other guy gets in that you've got to vote for me. Mr. Obama said that, that other guy, whatever his name was, said it too, and everybody went away happy because they had a contest.
I think the concern is with the degeneracy of public discussion and debate on a lot of issues, political, economic, whatever. All you'll get immediately is a torrent of name-calling, accusations, abuse, and so on, which doesn't really contribute anything at all to the problem. All of the accusations concerning other people's fundamental moral character and so on. That doesn't help at all. Mr. Foreman himself, for example, his favorite word used to be, in referring to the statements of people that he disliked or disagreed with, was that they were bellowing. And so have you been bellowing anything recently?
Yeah, I mean, if I had sort of taken a tactical approach, I mean, I was sort of completely discouraged from even wanting to say anything, but, and it wasn't like I was sort of sitting there saying, God, I wish I could say something, I just don't know. I mean, Jim Day, he's, I think, the person who writes most of the editorials of the News Gazette. I mean, they have a couple of whipping groups that they take out after in a way that I wouldn't consider civil, although there isn't the lack of civility that I would point at. One is, for instance, single mothers. I mean, when you talk about single mothers and the fact that so many of our, according to their editorial board, so many of our social problems can be related to single mothers, that doesn't seem like a very civil approach to understanding our social problems. Or calling, or insisting that in the wake of the movement to at least change the terminology of how we talk about immigrants to this country and not to refer to them as illegals. The News Gazette editorial board, in fact, in a way that is at least marginally non-civil, insists that they should be referred to illegals because that's what they're doing. So it's civility. I mean, I'm not even sure that it's, and maybe that's why Jim Day was claimed to have been the person who's arguing the con side in relation to the fact that civil discourse is a problem. But certainly it's all part of a system in which there is civil and what could be called civil and non-civil discourse, again, within this very limited range.
Glenn Greenwald had a marvelous column a month ago about the style of attacking Chomsky, or rather, attacks on Chomsky's style. And it really deserves a second look, because what he talks about is the way in which people who are unable to attack the sorts of things Noam Chomsky says about politics go after his style. And I think we have an example of that here in this civility talk. What we're doing, as I think Ron suggests, is avoiding any real discussion of political issues by concentrating on style. All right. Yeah. Understand where that's
again
coming
and
from.
again is that those who want to attack someone will start talking about what terrible writers they are. That one's been used against Dewey, who's not always a very clever writer. And
Randolph Bourne was.
yeah, and a number of other people, but they just can't seem to deal with the substance and will want to talk about what bad writer someone may be.
But what's remarkable about the criticism of Chomsky in this day and age is that as he's gotten older and older and has slowed down and his voice has lapsed into a kind of monotone,
Right.
and he speaks very slowly, there isn't, I mean, the substance, and I would say that in some sense the substance is just as strong, but it lacks a little of the bite that it did when he had a different sort of rhetorical style, and but he'll still get criticized, as you say, for the style. What's the style? What style does an 84-year-old man have who's still able to get up there and talk, for crying out loud?
Yeah, isn't there some value in not antagonizing people gratuitously, because when you do, they will stop listening to the substance of what you're saying?
Antagonizing people gratuitously, it seems to me that needs to be unpacked. Saying
Everything does.
no, but I mean, you know, that is a description that's sometimes placed on saying that simple matters of fact, such as the president kills children. Now, is that antagonizing people unnecessarily, gratuitously?
Yes.
And I would say it's a simple matter of fact, and that the willingness to ignore it is itself far worse, because in the name of civility or whatever, we swallow a camel. That's a terrible thing. We should call things by their right names. Actually,
well, let me just say, in terms of the, I think the fundamental thing that was avoided last night in this debate or this discourse, I mean, it was alluded to that this is about television, it's about cable news, although it's nothing new, it's just the current form of it. But I would, and there's an entertainment aspect, there's a media and entertainment and corporate aspect to all this, and it's who watches and what makes money and what advertisers, what people, as Chomsky always refers to in the manufacture of consent, what people are being sold to what advertisers. And this is what the corporations will allow the people to watch, and this is what will sort of entertain people in lieu of a genuine interest in politics. And I don't blame the population, unlike the debate over whether this is a bottom-up or top-down problem. I don't necessarily blame the population for either sort of passively consenting to this system or opting out of this system. And the bottom line isn't civility, it's apathy. And it's a kind of detachment from the political system because people don't have anybody to vote for.
Yeah. Has that been fostered by the educational system and the media? This passivity and
you think perhaps?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It seems to me that everything today is judged by its entertainment value, sometimes other values as well, but that's always an important element. And whether anything can become lifted above the level of a high school popularity contest is a real problem for us, I think. In politics, that's what things quickly degenerate into, something like that, I believe. And yeah, it's a problem. But who do we blame is another problem.
Well, that's why people keep asking us to be louder and funnier here at News from Neptune.
Right.
And we now come to the part of News from Neptune where we consider style, what we call Coburn's Corner. The corner has an edge, indeed a sharp edge. The last writing from the late journalist Alexander Coburn was a pamphlet, this one, called Guillotined. in which Coburn nominated cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. We want to carry on his great work by adding our own suspects to the kill list, which is a lot less literally lethal than Barack Obama's kill list. You've got a candidate today, Ron?
Yeah, let me suggest a pair of terms. Hard work, which is always prescribed to the lower classes and to poor people and so on. They must engage in hard work and hard-earned money.
Oh, good.
So we seem to have this enormous infatuation with hardness. And there's an interesting
Dr.
book.
Freud, please call your office.
Right. There's an interesting book by a sociologist about crime and kind of the phenomenology of crime. It used to be fashionable to talk about the criminal mind. Then it became fairly clear that there was no such thing. But the beliefs and attitudes of those who engage in crime sometimes, according to this writer, boil down to the desire to appear to be a hard man. And what this comes to is people who become infatuated with the idea of being a defiant maverick or renegade or outlaw or rebel and so on. And I don't know why that has such enormous appeal to a certain class of people, but apparently it does. Do you want to be a hard man?
It reminds me. I hadn't even planned to say this, but I've noticed that the word solid is used a lot especially in sports. But the quality of being solid it's become a real powerful adverb, adjective in our society. Pardon to my 10th grade English teacher. It's somehow the word solid to me is becoming less solid in the way that it's used to describe characters, qualities of certain
more or
people,
less,
certain lead teams.
Aware of the phenomenon that all of the solid melts into air.
Yeah. But the other one that I was going to sort of throw in today, and sort of in relation to the idea of civility, is the idea of interfaith dialogue is become, I think, a bit of a red herring in terms of understanding what the really fundamental issues are, which may be between religious groups or groups of various kinds, but I'm not sure if they are very often matters of faith. In fact, I think they're rarely matters of faith. So maybe we can haul out interfaith dialogue along with civility and various other, I think, sort of ways of avoiding more fundamental issues.
My candidate for today, actually it touches on several of the things that have been mentioned already, including David's yeoman service to the cause by showing up for the talk by the Lockheed Martin CEO. My candidate is defense industries. What's amazed me recently is, as in the connection with this talk on campus, the phrase is used and it's lost its inverted commas. It's used without irony. This man, Augustine, was a CEO of a defense industry. Now look, we all know that defense is a euphemism for American war making. And we also know that it came in when the War Department was renamed the Defense Department in the Truman administration, precisely to make this obfuscation about as America launched on its Cold War domination of the world. Look, it connects also to the point that I made at the beginning of the hour about the anti-war movement of the 1930s. In 1934, an important book was published by a young researcher at the University of Chicago by the name of Engelbrecht. It was called Merchants of Death. And he summarized simply the debate that had been going on for almost a decade then about the way in which arms manufacturers, American as well as British and so forth, were the principal movers behind the First World War. This was taken as a commonplace. It had the extra added advantage of being true, but it was taken as a commonplace in the American 1930s, and one of the reasons that there was such a vigorous anti-war movement in America in the 30s, the movement that had to be overcome by the Roosevelt administration, the reason that Pearl Harbor was necessary in the first place. So it seems to me that one of the terms we need to unpack from David's service this week has been, we might talk about...
There's that service word again.
I was going to say, we might talk about service there, too. You know, it was George Carlin who said that service was a funny word for killing people, when people who had been in the service, you know.
Yeah.
So defense and service, yes, those are my candidates.
And what Augustine said in response to the woman, the local woman, Amy Rickman, who brought up the issue, was the one dissenting voice in the audience who brought up the issue of his service in the military-industrial complex. His response was, well, if we're going to have a military, don't you want them to be well equipped?
Maybe we should simply examine the premise, huh?
Yes, exactly.
Should we say the same thing about the military of Iran and North Korea?
That's right. General disarmament.
Yeah.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 15th week of 2013. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been our Criminal Presidential War edition, and we've come full circle on that matter, I think. If our program has interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Tonight at 11 p.m., Democracy Now!, rebroadcast of this morning's program. Tomorrow at 7 a.m., tomorrow at 2 p.m., News from Neptune, this program, rebroadcast. At 3 p.m., the Populist Dialogues. This week, Remedies for Mounting Student Debt, a subject that has occurred in our deliberations. On Sunday, at 7 a.m., the White House Chronicles, 3:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogues, 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with our friends David Johnson and Jim Iman. Weekdays, 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, 8 a.m., The Big Picture, noon, Monday of this week. At 1 p.m., Labor's Worldview is repeated. At 2 p.m., Tom Hartman Live, a 3-hour nationwide call-in program. And at 5 p.m., European Journal on the Economic Crisis in Ireland and stories from the rest of Europe as well. Tuesday, 9:30 p.m., The White House Chronicle, and at 10 p.m., We're on the Air, starring Ron Szoke. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussers tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of the program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.